Well, good evening and welcome, everyone, to the Harvard Catholic Forum. I am Deacon Tim O'Donnell, Executive Director here, and I'm delighted you can be with us, both you who are here with us in Seaver Hall and Harvard Yard, and on the live stream. And I particularly extend a warm welcome to Metropolitan-Archbishop Borys Gudziak, who speaks tonight on matters of great urgency for human dignity, for world peace, and for the worldwide church, as he asks, what is at stake in Russia's war against Ukraine? Tonight's event is part of a broad range of lectures, non-credit courses, workshops, and other programs offered by the Harvard Catholic Forum. Programs where the Catholic intellectual and cultural tradition engages both the university community and the wider public. Check out our website at harvardcatholicforum.org, where you can sign up for our program announcements, register for future events, and support our important mission by making a financial contribution. All of our programs are free of charge, but they are not free to put on, so please help us. We depend on your contributions of any size to bring events like this one to you. Tonight's lecture will be archived on the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. If you like what you see and hear, please share the link to that channel with others. We always have more views on the archive than on day one, and everyone who is registered, both those on the live stream and those here, will receive by email a link to the recording in the next few days. An impressive group of co-sponsors joined the forum in welcoming Archbishop Gudziak to Harvard. Christ the King Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Hellenic College Holy Cross, the Melkite Catholic Eparchy of Newton, the Nova Forum at USC, and the Ukrainian Catholic University. And we extend special thanks to John and Julie Corcoran for underwriting this event. So let me give you a roadmap of tonight's program. Archbishop Gudziak's talk will last 35 or 40 minutes, followed by Q&A from the audience. Those of you who are here in person should have received a note card and pencil when you came in. Some of you, if you didn't receive a note card, but you received a survey, you can write your question on the back of the survey and pass that up just as well. So if you have a question, write it on the survey note or the card. And a few minutes after 6 or maybe 6:10, some of my colleagues will come up and pick up the cards and bring them to me. So if you have a card with a question, please raise your hand at that time. And they will come through again shortly after the Q&A starts to pick up additional questions. I will pass on as many of these questions as I can. Unfortunately, we are unable to take questions from the live stream audience today. And here's something important. Please help us to evaluate and improve our programs by filling out our 2-minute survey after today's program. Everyone who is here should have received a paper survey and pencil. Please drop the completed survey in the basket by the door as you leave. Tonight's speaker, Archbishop Borys Gudziak, is Metropolitan for Ukrainian Catholics in the United States, President of the Ukrainian Catholic University of Lviv, Ukraine, and Chair of the Committee on Domestic Justice and Human Development of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Trained as an historian and a theologian, he received his STB from the Pontifical Urban University, his STL from the Pontifical Oriental Institute, and a PhD in history from Harvard. Archbishop Gudziak has published and lectured widely for both academic and general audiences. And I might mention here the prologue he wrote in 2022 to Henry Nouwen's previously unpublished Ukraine diary, an account of their experience together, which grew out of a friendship which began here at Harvard, and their coming together in Ukraine at the beginnings of Ukrainian independence in the early 1990s. We'll have some copies of that book available at the reception for purchase after this talk. In 1993, Archbishop Gudziak was tasked with building a Catholic university from the foundation of the Lviv Theological Academy, and later became the university's rector. His honorary doctorates include those from Notre Dame, the Catholic University of America, and the Charles Borromeo Seminary. Please join me in welcoming Archbishop Borys Gudziak.
Thank you, Deacon Tim. It's wonderful to be back at Harvard. I was a slow learner. It took me 9 years to finish the degree. And I lived 7 of those years right above the Pamplona, if you know that, across the street from St. Charles, and was a daily communicant there with a choir school. So any of you that are part of that community or know anybody there, please pass on my great respect and gratitude for those years and those graces. I'm very honored by the presence of Bishop Francois Beiruti, Reverend Fathers, and all of you at this time. We're in the middle of Lent, and I just want to encourage all people of the Catholic community to take the opportunity that this season provides, and that this community, the Catholic community at Harvard, provides. It's a very rich community. When I was coming here after the seminary in Rome, many people said that I could lose my faith here. In fact, there's so much faith in Rome because so many people have lost it there. But it was a very rich experience, and its institutions and programs like this one that really touch the lives of students, of faculty, of visitors. And I thank you, Deacon, and our sponsors for supporting and running this program. The subject that has been announced is what's at stake in Russia's war against Ukraine. That kind of formulation reflects a rather popular way of approaching things. How much is there? How much is here? Where do we press? Where do we compromise? On one hand, if you look at the balance, you've got territories discussed, rare earths, minerals, geopolitical interests, nuclear power plants. On the other hand, you have freedom, dignity, independence, human rights, values. You have people. And from the very beginning, I'd like to emphasize that the whole discourse is skewed and often almost besides the point, because it isn't first and foremost a question of territory. Russia is not interested primarily in territory. It already is 28 times as big as Ukraine. It covers 11 time zones. It has vast expanses of territory that is not used, not exploited, not settled. It's not about NATO expansion. Even the Holy Father said, and I had an hour-and-a-half long discussion with him about this sometime after his statements, that, a president, that it was the growth of NATO barking at the door of Russia, that prompted this invasion. There was no NATO in the 18th century when the Hetmanate, the pre-modern Ukrainian Cossack state, was being dismantled. Catherine and other czars, There was no NATO when, after the Russian Revolution, Ukrainian independence was crushed by a combination of the white and red Russian forces. There was, in fact, no NATO at the end of World War II when Ukraine was incorporated fully into the USSR. It's a canard that Ukraine is a threat to Russia. It's one of the take-homes. There'll be a little quiz at the end, what you remember. Ukraine had 900,000 soldiers in 1991 when it claimed independence. By 2014, there were 15,000 battle-ready troops left. When Russia attacked through the little green men on the east and occupied Crimea. More importantly, at the behest, with the pressure, particularly of the United States, Ukraine, which had the third biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, bigger than that of France and China combined, gave up its nukes in exchange for guarantees of territorial integrity, independence, and freedom from economic pressure compromising its sovereignty. Ukraine was not a threat. Ukraine was not interested in somebody else's pocket, somebody else's territory, somebody else's history, somebody else's churches. A Christ-like gesture, unprecedented, at that time paralleled by Kazakhstan and Belarus, but Belarus now has nuclear weapons again, to manifest its desire to leave totalitarianism, repression, government control, aggressive international relations behind, to leave behind the genocides, and to live, to breathe, to give life, which it does. And this is also at stake. 40 million Ukrainians feed 400 million people. At stake is the ecology of a very variegated geography that step by step is being polluted, rendered dangerous. Ukraine now constitutes the biggest amount of land that is dotted by mines. It will take decades. If things stop today, it will take decades to demine Ukraine. When the dam in the Kherson area was mined, you saw it, whole vast territories of parks and waterways were polluted. There's much more at stake. At stake is the international law-based order. From World War II, with many nuances and minor exceptions, in the Western world, there has been a prevailing conviction and principle that countries, states, do not take away territory through military invasion. This policy has led to a cultural, economic, legal, human flourishing like no other in human history. It has given great peace and prosperity to the United States. We have not had a war on this territory. We've had allies. We've had friends. We've had trading partners with whom there might have been differences, but there was not armed conflict. Never before, as in the last 20 years, has poverty been reduced. A reduction of hunger, famine, disease, polio has almost been conquered. There are now great dangers after the cuts to the USAID funding, not only for polio and malaria, but infectious tuberculosis, death from diarrhea because of lack of clean water. American disengagement from the human community on different continents comes at great risk. Without Ukraine, Russia is not an empire. And that is really what is at stake. President Putin, who has been in power for 25 years, has initiated a 21st century colonial war. For much of the last century, and particularly in the last decades, countries, nations, ethnic groups, races, and also churches have been naming and lamenting their role in colonizing others. It was considered received moral principle that you just don't take somebody's land, their economy, their resources. You don't enslave people. Today we see a war that tries to reverse this. And it is explicit. It is a war that is explained. It's a war for which the reason is given. Ukraine is not a real country. It happened by accident, according to Putin. It is exactly the kind of imperialist rhetoric that has been used to justify colonial war, colonial conquest. The 20th century saw the unravelment of the empires. The French colonies, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman Empire. In the end, even the empire on which the sun never set, that of Great Britain. The Russian Empire is the last European empire of the 19th century that still stands. And maybe we can develop this in the question and answer period, but I think it is doomed by history. The question is when it will unravel. Because there are at least 100 ethnic groups in the Russian Federation, many of them whose identity, language, way of writing, way of speaking, way of living has been persecuted, limited, or even erased. Unfortunately, behind this neo-imperialism stands an ecclesial ideology. The Russian Orthodox Church has taken the place, filling the vacuum left by the Communist Party. And it has formulated a call that has become a motto of this war: the Russian world. The Russian world is any place where Russian political rule and the presence of the Russian Orthodox Church left a footprint that must be held together. And where any of that footprint has found itself in an independent territory, it needs to be recovered. The Russian world is not just Russia. It is the entire space where people speak Russian, think in Russian, and feel connected to Russian culture. Russia will always defend these principles. Like in Mariupol, do you remember that city? The city of Mary, city with Greek roots, Mariupolis. The most Russian-speaking city in Ukraine was defended to smithereens. We do not know how many people were killed in this city where the Azov steel plant was located, where maybe 50, maybe more thousand people were killed and buried in the rubble. No international agencies have access to count the casualties. Putin again in 2021 in that essay published the summer before the war. Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. Inalienable. There will be no cessation of war at the present lines. The intent from which Putin has not retreated one iota is to capture the entire country. The Russian Orthodox Church is not merely a defender of this ideology of the Russian world. It generates it. Patriarch Kirill in 2009 already, at a speech to the World Russian People's Council, said the following: "The Russian world is a God-given civilization that unites Holy Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, through a common faith and historical path." It's messianic. It's something that comes straight from the Lord. Holy Russia is our common home, and we must protect this spiritual unity against those who try to divide us. That was his statement after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. This war is not just political, it is metaphysical. It is about salvation, about standing against forces that want to destroy our unity. March 2022, immediately after the full-scale invasion. The World Russian People's Council, headed by Patriarch Kirill, in March 2024, said the following: "The entire territory of modern Ukraine should enter Russia's exclusive zone of influence. The possibility of a political regime hostile to Russia and its people existing on this territory must be completely excluded." If these things seem theoretical and maybe, matters for discussion, the rhetoric turns jihadist. The church realizes that if someone, driven by a sense of duty and the need to honor his oath, stays loyal to his vocation and dies while carrying out his military duty in Ukraine, without any doubt doing a deed that is equal to sacrifice. If you go to kill in Ukraine and you die, your sins will be forgiven. What is the consequence of this? In late February, in the weeks of March, in a time frame unprecedented in human history, 14 million people were forced from their homes. 8 million of them became international refugees, forced migrants, and 6 million became IDPs, internally displaced persons. Today, 10.6 million, according to the United Nations, are displaced by the war. About a quarter of its pre-war population. 3.7 are uprooted inside Ukraine, and 6.9 million, 7 million, are abroad. More than 2 million homes across Ukraine have been damaged or destroyed. And 1/3 of the population, about 13 million people, need daily humanitarian assistance. in the circumstances of martial law, war casualties of the military are not published. But the number of casualties in Ukraine is estimated between 50 and 300,000. If you walk in the Ukrainian streets of Ukraine, and I've been back 12 times since the big invasion, you see hundreds and even thousands of people, not all in one place at one time, who are amputees, without legs, without arms, without eyes. 20,000 children at least were abducted. Many of you are parents, uncles, nephews, grandparents. Just think of your child being abducted, being taken away, and brainwashed to hate you, to hate what you stand for, to hate your language, to hate your history. For this, President Putin and his ombudswoman for Children's Affairs has been indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague in March 2023 on war crimes charges. But some people tell us he's not a bad guy. The toll on educational infrastructure is equally severe. 380 schools have been reduced to complete rubble, while another 3,429, at the present statistic, 3,429 schools have suffered significant damage. Healthcare facilities have not been spared. More than 1,200 hospitals and clinics have been partially or fully destroyed. Just think of the equipment, the operating rooms, the x-rays, the scanners. But think of the people. Last summer, Okhmadit, the biggest children's hospital in Ukraine, in Kyiv, was hit by missiles at 10 a.m. in the morning, right when doctors are conducting operations. Every day, apartment buildings, shopping centers, railroad stations, hospitals, schools, museums are being hit, damaged, and destroyed. There is a concrete, specific effort to destroy Ukrainian culture. More than 1,200 museums, theaters, and concert halls have been destroyed. 1,200. We just walked a beautiful campus to be here. Imagine 1,200 cultural buildings targeted by Russian rockets, Iranian drones, and other systems of mass destruction. There's wanton religious persecution in the occupied territories. 20% of the country is presently under Russian occupation. Everywhere there are informal prisons. They call them the basements, to where people are taken and where they are tortured. Recent revelations about the detention of the Ukrainian journalist Victoria Rushchina have horrified the world. Arrested while reporting from occupied territories, she perished in a Russian prison, and her body remains in the hands of the Russian authorities. Ukrainian officials working to recover the bodies of civilians who died in Russian captivity report that 80% of those bodies bear signs of mistreatment and torture. These are not prisoners of war. We're talking about civilians. All religious communities who do not explicitly, enthusiastically support the Russian war are severely persecuted everywhere in the Russian occupied territories. This pertains to Ukrainian Orthodox and Catholics, Baptists, Pentecostals, Jews, and Muslims. And they are all together working through the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, making a stand against this war and helping to forge this incredible solidarity. Imagine 4 million IDPs in the country, but no pictures of refugee camps. The poor people of Ukraine are reaching out, receiving, harboring those who are absolutely destitute. 47 Ukrainian clergy have been killed in this war. 18 of them are from the Moscow Patriarchate Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. 12 Baptists, 8 Pentecostals, 7 from the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and 2 Adventists. So far, no Catholic priest has been killed, but 2 of our priests, Redemptorist religious, were abducted by the occupying authorities and tortured for 18 months. They were released only through the special efforts of Pope Francis and the Holy See. But they remain deeply traumatized, and it's not clear whether one of them will be able to emerge from the experience that he endured. But it's also important to know what's going on in Russia. In Russia, religious freedom is drastically curtailed. There are maybe 500,000 Ukrainian Catholics in the Russian Federation, but there's not a single registered legal Ukrainian Catholic parish. Today, there are about 40,000 clerics in the Russian Orthodox Church, of whom 40,000, it's priests and deacons together. Only about 30 that we know of for sure, maybe it's 40, maybe 50, have come out clearly criticizing this war. That's less than 1 out of 1,000. And many of them have been defrocked, persecuted, or even imprisoned. 999 out of 1,000 are silent. In the first weeks of the war, 300 clergy of the Russian Orthodox global community wrote a statement in support of peace. Today, every Russian cleric at every service is obligated to pray for victory in this war. And those 30 who have stepped back from that, many of them have done nothing more than to change the word victory with the word peace. That is cause for being defrocked, to be reduced to a lay status. The liberties of others, you can only imagine. Other religious communities. So what is at stake and why is it important? We already spoke of the fact that, well, you know who started this war, right? Maybe here that does not need to be emphasized. But Russia does not need a part of Ukraine or even the entire country. It wants to change the world order. It's pecking away at that system that gave us peace and prosperity for almost 4 generations. It's a colonial war. It's trying to roll back history. Something that we thought ended maybe at the end of the 18th century or in 1918, when at the end of World War II, many empires dissolved. Or in the 60s, when in 1977, Djibouti gained independence from France. But the last empire is not ready to bid farewell to colonialism. Let me quote a colleague, Timothy Snyder, who many of you listen to and admire. Putin's Russia is fighting not just a war against Ukraine, but against the idea of decolonization itself. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the largest decolonization of the 20th century, and Russia has never accepted that process as legitimate. In fact, Putin, as you know, has repeated, it is the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, the demise of the Soviet Union. Allow me to come back to what we said at the beginning. What is at stake? What is being weighed? This is not just a war about territorial integrity. It's a war in a defense of human integrity. In the 21st century, when it seems increasingly almost everything can be bought and sold, negotiated, when truth is transactional, when media, politics, diplomacy, and popular culture are conditioned by a post-truth ethic. There's your truth, there's my truth, here's the facts, oh no, there's alternative facts. Ukrainians are saying, not so fast, friends. Not everything is up for grabs. There is good and there is evil. There is truth and there are lies. And we're willing to risk our life for it. Consciously, deliberately, and freely. This is where Ukraine makes the stand. Of course, there's tremendous trauma. People are not naive. People don't live in fantasy land. You're brought down to earth if for 3 years, basically every night, there's an air raid siren. You don't have illusions about what continued war means when young people, students, go to more funerals than they do weddings of their friends. Ukrainians, more than anybody, want peace. But they understand that Russian occupation leads to genocide. It has in the past. Between 1914 and 1950, in a short, relatively short 35-year period, maybe as many as 15 million Ukrainians lost their lives in an unnatural way through war, famine artificially created, and genocidal policies, including the Holocaust, the Holodomor. Many of these policies were generated in Moscow. The Gulag system and the repressive system of Stalin was carefully studied by Hitler and became a model. It's just that Hitler added some German efficiency to it. Ukrainians know this. They know what Russian rule, what rule from Moscow brings. And if anybody forgot or did not know the history, what has happened since February 24th, 2022, has brought it home. And so, fathers say, I'm going to war. 1 million have. I'm going to wars so that for once and for all, we put an end to this. I heard the stories from my grandparents and great-grandparents. I want my children and grandchildren to have a different history, a different narrative. Ukrainians are very grateful to Americans, very grateful to people of faith. The Catholic Church in the U.S. has taken a particularly solid stance of solidarity. And that is known and welcomed. When I was in Bucha, at the church where there were mass graves, the church lady that sells candles told me, when you go back, thank the Americans. Thank them. Because we're ready to make a stand. We're making a stand for our freedom and for your freedom. We need all the help that we can get, but the principles are clear. The goal is clear. We want to preserve God-given human dignity. And the buck stops here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Let me start with this question from Father John.
I should sit there.
Christian churches are not always good at working together. Orthodox churches are notorious for their strained relations here. We can come and have a seat. Orthodox churches are notorious for their strained relations. In Ukraine, what are honestly the relations between the Ukrainian Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church of the Ukraine?
So did everybody hear that question? What are the relations between the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine? Now, there are now two main Orthodox churches in Ukraine, and it's a little confusing. And in the abbreviation, the order of the letters is switched. There's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the UOC, and the Ukrainian Church, no, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the OCU. The first one is the church in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. And because it is in communion of the Moscow Patriarchate, it's not in communion with the Patriarchate of Moscow, because the Patriarchate of Moscow ruptured communion with the Orthodox Church of Russia, because Patriarch Bartholomew recognized the autocephaly of the the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, OCU. And that has been the case since 2018. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is the largest in terms of number of parishes. It had about 13,000 parishes. You remember that I told you that the Ukrainian Catholic Church has no legally recognized parishes in the Russian Federation. But the Moscow jurisdiction was allowed to have 13,000 parishes in Ukraine. However, after the granting of the Tomos of autocephaly, autocephaly means self-headedness, independence, to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, more and more of the Orthodox population has been drifting from the Moscow jurisdiction to the Kiev autocephalous jurisdiction. And the question was asked, what is the relation between the Greek Catholics and this second one? They vary. Both are active and cooperative members, as was until recently the Moscow Jurisdiction Church, members of the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. In Ukraine, by law, there is no official state church, like there is in Austria or Belgium, for example. In the United Kingdom, there is no official church. All churches, according to the law, are guaranteed equal rights. And one of the phenomena of Ukrainian independence is the denominational variety of Ukraine. In that sense, it's very much analogous to what we have in the United States. There's freedom and there's parallel existence. In the early 1990s, there were strong tensions when Greek Catholics were coming out from the underground after 45 years of illegal existence, when all of their churches were stripped and many given to the Russian Orthodox Church. As they were emerging from the underground and reclaiming their churches, and some of those Orthodox churches then were declaring themselves autocephalous, freeing themselves from Moscow tutelage, there were great tensions. Today there is a confessional rivalry. Not every Ukrainian Catholic or Ukrainian Orthodox, celebrates the successes of the other. But that's maybe part of our human nature. We don't always rejoice in the fact that the professor next to me has published 3 more books than I have, or that the business, that I compete with is going through the roof on the stock exchange. But it is a relationship of peace. And most importantly, in these circumstances, it is a relationship of a unified vision of what is most important in the country. Most important in the country is to win this war, to survive, to help the poor, to help those who are injured. And both churches work on these fronts.
Thank you. Here's a hard question that's very short. How do we reach peace without starting World War III?
Well, I'm not a military strategist, but I think the best way to avoid World War III is not to let warmongers feel that they can initiate war and succeed in war. We now have a more than 3-year record that we can look back on. And the brakes on aid to Ukraine were often applied because there was fear of World War III, or there was fear that Putin might use nuclear weapons. And so we will not give this weapon system, or that weapon system, or the third or the fifth. And as you probably know, if you followed events, with time, the first and the second and the third and fourth weapon systems were added on, and there was no escalation because there was engagement in defense of Ukraine. This is subjective, but it's real. And allow me to share it with you. In my dealings with the KGB in the Soviet Union, and in my dealings with security services after the Soviet time, in memoirs that dissidents have left behind, there's one basic principle of dealing with bullies. You cannot show them fear. You have to look them in the eyes and tell them the truth. And do what you can. Sometimes they have more power than you. But you can't let them eat your soul. And this is a word today to universities and to this university. You have to make a stand for the truth. And the truth prevails. Sometimes you have to sacrifice your life. But this is what Ukrainians are saying, and they're saying it to the world, they're saying it to the allies. Do not be afraid. Do the right thing. Don't let Putin dictate your stance. That has not happened. In fact, the opposite was what led to this war. If Ukraine had been part of NATO in 2008, this war would not have happened. And it was the resistance of France and Germany that stopped Ukraine and Georgia from becoming members of NATO. Both countries subsequently were invaded, first Georgia, and then 6 years later, Ukraine. Was it predictable? Read what Putin said. Read what the patriarch preaches. It's explicit. The plans are there. They're not going to stop at Ukraine because the footprint includes Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. The sphere of influence includes Poland, Romania, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc. The writing is on the walls. And the problem is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, we stepped back from studying, from being close. The Germans instituted the approach Wandel durch Handel. Change through business. We'll do business with them, and we're going to change them to be like us. And Putin, who was saying all along what he intends to do, did what he said he would do. He rearmed. He repressed civic, religious, political freedom. He killed opponents. And the Germans and French just kept on doing business and funded this war project and continued to do so until recent days. And only now, belatedly, are saying we were wrong, when Ukrainians were telling them all along that this is not going to lead to good. In fact, President Ronald Reagan in the 80s told the Germans, don't get dependent on Soviet fossil fuels. Don't do those pipelines. Biden okayed the pipeline at the beginning of his presidency, the last of the pipelines, which is now a multi-billion-dollar piece of junk on the bottom of the ocean. There's, you know, we pay a big price for wishful thinking. And it's kind of good to listen to what people say. It's important to hear what Putin says. In the last weeks, there has not been one iota of stepping back from his intentions. Not one, in the slightest way. All the concessions were offered before, yeah, Ukraine won't be in NATO, and they're going to have to sacrifice their territories, which means sacrificing the people. Somebody comes into your living room, takes over, and then the police tell you, well, why don't you negotiate? You know, just let them keep your living room. You know, they're not going to attack your dining room and knock on your door, bedroom door. Ukrainians want one simple thing. They want the thief out of the house because they know this thief. He speaks clearly. So appeasing people like Putin is, I think, the fastest way to World War III, because that's what happened with World War II.
All right, thank you. You mentioned a multi-religious council that's active during the war. Was it active before the war? And could you say more about its evolution and activities, and maybe about its future as well?
It's almost 30 years ago when the council was formed. It is interreligious. I think there's 17 different confessions that are members. Every 6 months, the leader or representative of one of the confessions becomes the head and spokesperson for the whole group for a 6-month period. This group does not deal with confessional doctrine, but it deals with social and civic issues. And it usually functions by unanimous consensus. In 2013 and 2014, also with the participation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, it was very clear and unanimous in speaking to the Ukrainian government that people have the right to express their opinion on the Maidan, that there should be no violence against the people, that the issues at hand should be resolved through negotiations, and that the rhetoric from the government should not be divisive. And that was a refrain repeated regularly throughout the weeks of the Maidan. After the Russian invasion, all communities, including the Moscow Patriarchate, came out with a joint statement against the war and against the Russian invasion, naming Russia as the invader. Unfortunately, numerous members at all levels, episcopal, clergy, and at the level of faithful from the Moscow Patriarchate jurisdiction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, have been found to be active collaborators with the Russian invaders. And this is something that has led to the progressive departure of people from this church. Religious sociology in Ukraine is not well developed, and it's not easy to conduct it in wartime circumstances. But it is clear that this church that has all of these parishes, this has a network that has been financially supported by Russian oil money and by some Ukrainian oligarchs, has been losing, steeply losing popularity in the country.
You talked about the Russian Orthodox Church having taken over the place of Soviet ideology in Russia. Looking at the Russian Orthodox Church and at Russia generally, is there any hope there? I think the picture you painted was quite a bleak picture. I just wonder if you think there's any hope.
It's bleak. It's worse than bleak. Let me make it darker. You've heard Putin speak about the decrepit West, the debauchery, the lack of moral principle in Western countries. Do you have any idea how many people go to church in Russia? It's about 1%. Church attendance is higher in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, the most secularized countries of the West. Russia is the leader, global leader in abortion statistics. Putin, the great defender of traditional values, has been in power for 25 years, now with almost, maybe not absolute, but definitely authoritarian power, and Russia is still the leader. It has both, according to male and female alcoholism, it's in the top 5, well, top 10 for sure, maybe top 5. The depression rate is very high. The life expectancy of males is in the mid-60s. This is a society that is in the hands of kleptocracy, in which the absolute leader has made a social contract with the oligarchs basically saying you can steal as long as you don't challenge me. And those who have been challenged have paid a dear price over the last 20 years. The media is controlled, the confessions are controlled, and in the meantime, the Russian population suffers from terrible public health services, from social alienation, from substance abuse, and high suicide rate. So there is great concern for the people of Russia. We are all children of God. Everybody, in every country and on every continent. And we should pray and somehow, maybe eventually, directly, if not now indirectly, try to help the population of Russia. Sergei Chapnin, who was the executive editor of the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate, a close collaborator of the central offices of the Russian Orthodox Church, who now is a scholar at Fordham University. In my house, to the papal nuncio and to the nuncio, the papal representative at the United Nations, in responding to this question, after, I don't want to say beating around the bush, but explaining many things, said, until Russia falls and until the Russian Orthodox fall, the church falls, there will be no reform. That sounds pretty drastic. But the realities are, as long as this regime stays in place, as long as this way of living the church stays in place, as long as only 1 out of 1,000 clerics is able to condemn this war, to speak out, to articulate the fullness of the gospel, to not fold it, bend it, manipulate it, and distort it into an ideological instrument, the situation will remain bleak. However, the night is darkest, before the dawn. And it is not only a question of our discernible geopolitical, military, economic, and other analyses. God is at work. Can I ask you to raise your hands? Who in October of last year was thinking about the demise of President Assad in Syria? Did anybody think that Assad's regime would be over? And then a moment came and it was gone. Some of you are old enough to remember in the 1980s. How many of us, even those who held hunger strikes for the freedom of Soviet political prisoners, who went on marches to demonstrate for the freedom of the Greek Catholic Church, who traveled to Washington in 1983 to participate in a big, 1983, to participate in the big rally on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Holodomor. How many of us really believed that the Soviet Union would fall apart in our lifetime? And that it would fall apart? You did. God bless you. But it happened. I don't know if you foresaw how it fell apart. Nobody could believe it. It just crumbled like a house of cards because it was built on lies. It was built on repression. It was built on falsehood. It was built on sin. I don't know what is in the readings of the Roman Catholic Church at Lent, but as we were entering Lent and during the first weeks, we had the readings from Genesis, the book of Genesis, the creation account. And in the creation account, there's one basic, theme. God gives. God gives life. God creates in a gesture of magnanimity. God wants to share. God invites others, his creatures, to share in his divinity, in his realm, in his Garden of Eden. And he says, dear people in whom I rejoice, you are the apple of my eye. You are the treasure of my creation. I ask you and warn you, do not take of this tree. Do not grab this fruit from the tree of knowledge, because that is the sign of your rejecting your creature-like identity and rejecting the fact that I am your creator. You are creating an idol. You want to replace me with yourself. And that is the tragedy of our human race. From there, it degenerates to the first murder, the killing by a brother of a brother. God calls us to live the gift, and we die when we live the grab. Whether it's in the kitchen or at work or in family or in community or in country or internationally. The grab is sin. The grab is death. And sooner or later, the truth prevails. And that's going to happen with the Russian Empire. You remember George Bush's trip to Ukraine? George Bush Sr., beginning of August 1991. He came into the Ukrainian parliament and wagged his finger at the parliamentarians. Don't you dare, I'm paraphrasing, think of independence. Your thoughts of separatism are suicidal. Your nationalism. 3 weeks later, Ukraine declared independence, subsequently in December ratified by a referendum over 90%, and the Soviet Union was history. The incapacity to see what is happening, to see the factors. People like Zbigniew Brzezinski were clear on these issues. But the incapacity, whether Bush Sr. or Bush Jr., who said, I looked him in the eye, saw his heart, and saw he's an honest man, Putin. Or Obama, who one of his great quips in winning the election with Mitt Romney was, Mitt, you're saying that Russia is our biggest geopolitical adversary? Mitt, correct me if I'm wrong, your economics are in the 30s, your social thinking is, in the 50s, and your geopolitics is in the Cold War. Great quip, lots of laughs. He won the election, and he appeased Putin and did nothing in 2014. His successor, President Trump, has had nothing but praise for Putin. It's the only political leader whom Putin has not, who President Trump has not criticized. He's smart, he's strong, a genius act in invading Ukraine. Who started this war? But it's not only an American issue. Berlusconi, the far right, the Donald Trump of Italy, and the center-left Prodi, Prime Minister and head of the European Union. Both of them, personal friends of Putin. A friend of mine who's a friend of Prodi in the first days of the war told me, Prodi's still thinking of calling Putin and talking some sense into him. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? Does Prodi think that Putin will listen to him? He's been playing you like a fiddle for the last 20 years. He's induced you to say to Ukrainians after the Orange Revolution, New Zealand will become a member of the European Union before Ukraine. Sarkozy allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to have a plot of land funded by the Russian Federation near the Tour Eiffel with a big cultural center. which is very close to the foreign ministry. And all the listening devices, are right there next to the cupolas. And everybody sees it as you go down the Seine. I don't know if I should continue with the German leaders, Anyway, there are certain things that are hard facts, and no amount of wishful thinking moves them to the side.
Thank you. But perhaps one final question. What was it like to come here? You mentioned this briefly in the beginning of your talk, but what was it like to come here as a graduate student and be here as a graduate student of history, looking forward to whatever you were planning in life at that time? So if you could speak a little bit personally about your time here.
I'm very grateful to the Lord, for His providence and His guiding and priding hand. My first time, I came here in 1977. I was 16 years old, and I came to Harvard Summer School. It's almost half a century ago. And one of the persons that welcomed me here, where are you, Lubko? He's sitting there. If you could raise your hand, Lubomir Haida. He actually looked, you haven't changed in 50 years, Lubko. And that was a summer school experience. After that, I went to college, which I finished quickly in a couple of years, and then I went to the seminary in Rome for 3 years. And it was only after that that I started graduate school. I was 22 years old. It was 1983. Frankly speaking, a seminarian coming from what was a very regimented context in the circle of Patriarch and Cardinal Joseph Slipy, a survivor of the Gulag, coming from there to Harvard was, coming to a different planet. But there were commonalities. There was a great devotion to scholarship in the formation that I had in Rome. His beatitude created a prototype of the Ukrainian Catholic University in Rome, because his predecessor had tried to create a Ukrainian Catholic University. The Austrian authorities and then the Polish interwar authorities didn't allow for it, and even the theological faculty then was closed down by the Soviets once and then a second time, and then he was arrested and put in prison, sent to labor camps and exiled for 18 years. And all of a sudden, in 1963, in February, as a result of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, he gets released. Why? Because Pope John XXIII intervened between Khrushchev and Kennedy, trying to lower the temperature. And Khrushchev was grateful for that, and he wanted to make a gesture of gratitude to a pope that was, he kind of saw something similar. They were both bald and round, and and the Pope said, "Why don't you release Metropolitan Joseph Slipy?" And Khrushchev apparently thought or said, "You mean he's still alive? I put him in prison 18 years ago because he was head of the Communist Party in Ukraine in 1945 when the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was liquidated as a visible structure, and all the bishops were arrested." We're talking now 40 years after almost that liquidation. I had gone to Rome to be a seminarian of the church in Ukraine. I joined that exiled archbishop as his seminarian, which is like being a seminarian for a diocese on Mars. I couldn't go there. Ironically, my status as a Harvard graduate student and researcher allowed me to apply for international exchanges, and that's how I got in there. And in 1988, because in previous years, trying to make visits from Poland, I couldn't get a visa. And so coming here was, you know, it was a vigorous experience. Those who know the Ukrainian Research Institute know that the legend has it that its founder and director, at the time I was here, was thought to know about 60 languages. Harvard was the epicenter of pre-modern Slavic studies, with the most rigorous philological, historical, kind of positivistic approach. You can share your ideas and your hypotheses, and I think this and that, after you read this text and tell me what it means and give its, you know, kind of concrete conjugations, etc. It was a very rigorous school, and I was a bit of a grunt. You know, there were very talented people. I pointed out Professor Haida, but you know, others were much more talented than me. I had to sweat, and it took me a long time. It took me 9 years to finish the PhD. As I said, I was a slow learner. But at the same time, after the first semester, I realized that Henry Nouwen is teaching here. And I'd read a book of his in Rome. I thought it was pronounced Newen. And then he became one of the closest friends of my life, and he came to Ukraine twice. And I recommend, if you haven't read that book, The Ukraine Diary by Henry Nouwen. He wrote it right as Ukraine was giving up its nukes, and he wrote, "I am worried what the Russians are going to do." This theologian, a man of peace, a man, you know, a progressive Catholic, hardly, you know, in the mold of Reagan or, you know, any right-wing warmongering or other, you know, kind of aggressive approach. But he saw it then, better than I did, actually. So Harvard was an incredible experience. There were great challenges. The old school faculty were not only demanding, today it would be called abusive. They wouldn't get by, you know, with all the political correctness today, even with the rollbacks. But it was an experience. Everybody flocked to this Ukrainian Research Institute from the whole world. And Professor Prytsak tried to bring people from Poland, from other countries. It was very, at the end, actually, also from the Soviet Union, to give them a chance to breathe. And one of the people that came to visit in 1987 was today's professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard, Serhiy Plokhy. That's when I met him for the first time, almost 40 years ago. He was one of the first of the younger Ukrainian scholars that was allowed to make an international visit, at least in the humanities, scholars in the humanities. So many worlds ended up coming together. And then the whole project of developing a Catholic university in a country. There are 200 universities in Ukraine, but right now the Ukrainian Catholic University has the highest incoming SAT scores. But it's a community of love, and it's a community that was very much supported by Harvard faculty and members of this Ukrainian studies world. So the relationship has continued, and whether it's the Catholic part of Harvard or the academic part of Harvard, it's always a bit of a homecoming for me. And I thank you for offering me this opportunity.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I have a couple final things to say, but before I do, could you give another round of applause?